very pleased to have here my friend Bronwyn Nielsen. I know she's coming with some guests. The idea to have this session, we will be discussing the role of the private sector. Hello, Bronwyn. Good to see you here with us. Thank you very much for your participation. I know that you are among many important guests. So thank you very much, Bronwyn.
And we'll dive straight into our session, which of course is within the broader theme, as you've alluded to, the seminar Renewable Energy in Brazil and Africa. We're talking about, as you said, Shah, the infrastructure, finance and renewable energy, fostering private partnerships for private-public partnerships for shared prosperity. Just to go through my panelists today, Mr. Antonio Pinheiro Silveira. He's Vice President for Infrastructure of the Development Bank of Latin America. Ms. Rentia von Tonder, Head of Renewable Energy, Power and Infrastructure at Standard Bank, South Africa. We have Mr. Patrick Dlamini, President of the Development Bank of Southern Africa. We are also joined by Mr. Hector Gomez-Ang, who is the country manager for Angola, Mozambique, Zambia, and Botswana at the International Finance Corporation, and Mr. Quentin Sauzay, who is a director at SouthBridge Group. Thank you all very much for joining me. Of course, we're looking to a climate-smart future. We need all stakeholders around the table to get together with solutions from an infrastructure perspective, from a finance perspective, to ensure that renewable energy can thrive as we move forward. And I'm going to open it up at this stage to Antonio from the Development Bank of Latin America. Antonio, can you give us your thoughts on the agenda when it comes to a climate-smart future and how development banks should be enabling this as an imperative going forward?
Thank you very much for the question, Bronwyn. Pleasure to be here. And you know, just introduction in a nutshell, CAF is a regional development bank for Latin America that has as associates 19 countries, 2 of them non-regional, Portugal and Spain, 17 regionals where we have a lot of activity and infrastructure in general. Going directly to your question, more broadly in terms of the challenge for sustainability in Latin America, we have to look, I think, on 3 big issues that are correlated. One of them, of course, starting with climate change and energy transition. This is a huge challenge. But together with that, the issue of inequality and the sources of inequality, especially the digital divide, or as like some academics call it, it's very challenging for the region. Those 3 things that are closely related have to be addressed in our role in CAF is try to feed up quality infrastructure in the G20 concept for our countries in order to tackle with those issues, especially in terms of energy. You know, Latin America more broadly has a clean energy matrix, like 50% in the whole region comes from hydroelectric. But of course, targeting the future, the non-traditional renewables are the solution to go ahead. And I can say that we have some very nice success stories around the region. I can mention Chile, Uruguay, and Costa Rica, for example, that are countries that they made the certain equation for attracting private sector, providing the right incentives, and they managed to really have a boost of non-traditional renewables, especially solar and wind. Chile specifically is turning off his coal-based matrix very quickly. And this is a very good news for the whole region. But beside of that, one thing that we have to have in mind is that with this progress of the renewables, a lot of countries in the region are becoming not only self-sufficient, but they will have disposal of energy for exporting. And the two big markets on the region are Brazil and Argentina as importers. Brazil traditionally imports a lot from Paraguay, but will need in the long run to expand the sources for import energy. Argentina, the same. So the issue of interconnection, or more broadly, regional integration of the grids is very much a challenge for supporting this boom of the renewables. And of course, I think the countries have to start thinking about regional integrated markets, and this is the big challenge looking ahead, included for private sector. I will stay here and be in the next round. Thanks.
Antonio, I think regional integration, you've hit the nail on the head. And Rentia, I'm going to bring you in here because this is something obviously that is on the agenda with the African continent, if we continents. And effectively, if we can achieve integration, maybe we will be able to deliver energy to the 600 million people or so in Africa that do not have access to any electricity. Of course, this, without the legacy infrastructure, presents a huge opportunity as well, given that we could move to renewables to solve the problem, the very, very severe problem of lack of electricity across the African continent. Can you come in at this juncture?
Thanks, Bronwyn. Just to give everybody a sense of who Standard Bank is, so just briefly, we are in 20 sub-Saharan African countries, focusing mainly as a commercial bank with 3 key pillars, one being wealth, one being trade, and one being corporate and investment banking. So we do have a presence along these countries, and one of the key growth areas certainly is the extension of facilities and funding of the power sector, so to stimulate economic growth. And the number you've mentioned is widely seen as, you know, even conservative. 600 million people in Africa without access to power. It is just unacceptable. So I think coming from an angle where we've been very involved in the development and funding of projects, specifically looking at how do we drive the green agenda, I think there's one argument to be made, and that is to what extent does Africa need power, and how difficult is it to actually do, you know, long-term investment in some of these investment climates that is difficult jurisdictions, challenging sovereign appetite for some of our commercial banks. And I always say, when we do these type of projects in Africa, you need to look at the 3 Ps, and it's not private partnerships, it's actually patience, partnerships, and you need to be present. So I think that's very important in Africa. We do see the PPP framework, whilst partnering with governments in developing the right frameworks to enhance these type of power projects. I think, to be quite frank, in Africa, it does take long. It's our sense from operating in the region and trying to facilitate regional integration, as you referred to, as being extremely difficult. In many cases, there's money available, but there's not enough bankable projects, which make it difficult because you've got a lot of development financiers and commercial banks chasing these really good projects and looking at countries where there's very clear programs and support. I'm not necessarily saying incentives, but a diligent program which is actually showing a commitment towards renewables. And these are not easy processes to follow. Governments need support. They need assistance. I think the Development Bank of South Africa has played a very important role in South Africa as an example to support the government and assist our IPP office in rolling out the renewable program. So we've been involved in other countries. I mean, obviously, South Africa at this point leads the rollout of renewable energy. We've been involved in Kenya doing renewable energy projects, as well as Namibia. More recently, we've seen other countries also becoming more and more enthusiastic about the green agenda. And I think IPP projects with sovereign offtake is one element. The other element that we can't ignore, and I won't go into that as we speak, but it's certainly on the off-grid side and captive power, where more and more companies say, I want to be a green company. I want to buy power from myself, generating solar power and being more sustainable in terms of ESG goals. So we've definitely seen that taking off across Africa as well. And I believe a massive opportunity for all of us, to work together towards this opportunity. Thanks, Bronwyn.
Patrick, I'm going to bring you in here. Rentia throwing forward to the Development Bank of South Africa and your crucial role in renewable energies in South Africa itself and driving that program together with the government. Perhaps you can weigh in with the lessons that you've learned over this period, considering that we are looking at the synergies between obviously Brazil and Africa and what we can learn from one another.
Thank you, Bronwyn. As Rentia actually highlighted, I think it's quite important the role that as a DFI and as a policy instrument of the state that we had to play in the South Africa's Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Program. We call it REIPPP. This was a PPP program that actually took off like a bullet, so to speak. And it has been quite commended by the United Nations in the manner that the South African government was able to undertake. But as the Development Bank of Southern Africa, we played quite a catalytic role in ensuring that we are able to make it to take off at the IPP office. We still are actually an implementing agent. But what was key was the catalytic effect that actually our involvement had in terms of the private sector, because we want to crowd in the private sector. We want to make sure that the private investors are able to come in and play a role, because as public finances are quite limited, both in the DFIs as well as in governments. So central fiscals don't have to take a strain for economic infrastructure in particular. So, and this was also driving the renewable energy, which is actually has become the right thing to do for the globe, and under the auspices of the United Nations and Paris Agreement. So for us, what was important was how do we make sure that these structures are in such a way that actually the private sector plays a very meaningful role, but the role that was played by government in terms of a well-coordinated legal framework for the program was extremely important. But the Ministry of Finance really, and the Minister of Energy, they led the pack and they were easy to support. But then drawing in the power utility was extremely important for offtake agreement. But we've also learned a lot of lessons over the years as well, that actually we need to make sure that the transmission becomes as independent from the power utility as possible, because it has to deal with the private suppliers, so that the playing field is fair. And also the other issue was that of currency in the process, because local currency was extremely important, because then you do not put unnecessary exchange rate challenges to the system. But the local currency funding was extremely critical. And the suppliers were able to come up with their own hedging strategies. But it is something that we are now busy trying to share the experience with our sister DFIs and countries across the continent, because we do believe that we have an abundance of sunshine, on average about 325 days that the continent has of sunshine. So we really can be able to meaningfully bring in renewable energy and also microgrid, as Rentia was talking about, referring to earlier on, that the off-grid solutions will also be able to drive much more quicker the progress of access to energy and the issue of inclusivity for the people of the continent. I mean, we have to cover 600 million people that are still without power at this point in time. and we need to find ways of getting this off the ground as soon as possible. But also the idea of regional integration and regional power pools will be extremely important across the continent to make sure that we do like Europe is doing. I mean, Antonio was referring to also the Latin America's regional integration in terms of the power packets between countries. It's extremely critical, because at least then you don't have one country taking the burden of having its entire power utility generation to itself. We can be able to share with each other and buy from each other, and thereby fast tracking and accelerating the availability of energy, which is so much a serious catalyst for economic growth and opportunities for the peoples of the continent. Thanks, Bronwyn.
Hector, is the IFC putting their weight behind power pools, as alluded to by Patrick, as being very important in terms of a solution if we are driving a climate smart future?
Thanks. Thanks, Bronwyn, and thanks for the invitation. Yes, I think the quick answer to that is yes. That's power, particularly, and sort of clean power, renewables. It's a core of our business. One thing maybe just about IFC. So we are part of the World Bank Group, and we're concentrated on private sector development, right? So we work through the private sector, and our development impact is what our clients do with the money and the advice that we provide. Overall in power, we have around $8 billion globally. That's our portfolio. Around 20% of that is in sub-Saharan Africa, okay, and around 17% of that is in Latin America, just the two relevant regions here. But if you look at it, because as I was preparing for this conversation, around 50% of our portfolio is essentially renewables, right? So you could see, I mean, then you slice it. If you remove hydro because you don't consider it, it's not renewable, then it goes down to 30%. But still, it's growing, and I think. We used to finance around $500 million between wind and solar 5 years ago. And we quadrupled that amount in 5 years, right? But I think, it still has a long way to go. But I think, and I would agree with my colleagues here, is that before COVID, and I'm sorry to bring COVID to this, I don't want to be a party pooper here, but, before COVID, countries were already, sort of facing a lot of challenges, right? But as COVID hits, together with the global, the global situation that we have, countries are emerging, because we're emerging from this with higher debt, with less fiscal space, with more fiscally vulnerable, with a really worsening external context because of commodities, because of tourism. So the bottom line is that the countries have less space to support this, to provide support. So I think it becomes even more important that governments become and position themselves as enablers, not as investors, but as enablers of private sector development, right? And that's something that it's easily said, and it works, it's perfectly on a PowerPoint, you need to be an enabler, but it's how do you really do that? Maybe I'll just quickly mention the way we approach it in IFC, and this is the World Bank approach, is we call it the cascade, and there is no rocket science to it, but essentially it's a mindset, right? So we take a situation, let's say a project, and we say, okay, so can the private sector develop it and finance it? Is it so then if the answer is yes, then it should be 100% private project. But then if the answer is no, then you see, okay, so what do we need to do? What changes in the regulation are needed? What's the public policy agenda that needs to be in so that we can actually make this project viable, right? And this is where it starts going slightly away from actually just financing to really engaging with the government into regulatory work and into getting your hands dirty into creating the enabling environment. And then you go with this thinking and you say, okay, then assuming I solve that, the project is still not viable for some reason. Can I use some public resources? Can I use blended finance? Can I use some sort of public support, the minimum necessary to make it viable? And then if you say no to all of these things, then it's really a public finance decision, right? So in this mindset, I think a lot of our effort has been, maybe a lot of it on financing, of course, but then a big portion of it has been on engaging with governments in trying to create those conditions, right? So that the governments can actually I think Antonio mentioned or so mentioned, one of the key challenges is it's not the lack of money, it's the lack of good projects to be financed, right? So we need to work towards making those projects available. I'll stop there for the time.
Absolutely. I think you pick up on some very crucial themes. So the lack of bankable projects long been a key issue that we need to delve into further in this discussion. And don't apologize for bringing in COVID. It needs to form a significant part of our discussion, given that it's not only governments that aren't going to have space to aggressively drive into renewable energies and into a climate smart agenda. It's going to be private sector capital as well that is constrained. I think we'll come back to it in a significant theme just momentarily, but I want to bring Quentin in here. And Quentin, before we jump into COVID again, you have been quoted ahead of this discussion as talking about your enthusiasm around the African renewable energy revolution. So let's get some momentum from your side into the conversation as you see it. I mean, again, Hector alluding to the tripling of investment in the space and 50% of their projects in the power space into the renewable space. Hector, is that correct? Am I quoting your numbers correctly? So Quentin, over to you. Let's bring you in and let's talk about this renewable energy revolution that is gripping Africa.
Yeah, thanks a lot, and thanks once again for inviting me. And I couldn't agree more with what's being said earlier on by my colleagues. And I just want to present a bit SouthBridge for the moment, because we are a Pan-African investment bank present in several countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, and created by Donald Kaberuka, who's the former head of the African Development Bank, and Lionel Zinsou, the former Prime Minister of Benin. And we have one mission is really to foster African development. And I am in charge of the sustainable desk in SouthBridge, and I've been covering the subject formerly also at the World Bank, and been following very carefully, I mean, the renewable energy sector, and especially I would say the access to energy sector. And I'm very enthusiastic because I think that now it's not a matter of technology. It's definitely a funding matter. We have companies that have the solutions to actually bring energy to those 600 million people lacking this access to energy in the continent. But the issue that we have is that at some point we'll need a major push in order to provide a blended finance, because the reality is that those people don't have access to energy because it's not bankable to bring them energy. Otherwise, the price of this energy would be way too high if you compare with their financial capacity. So definitely here, I think there's still a big effort to be made by public funding sectors and also governments in order to be able to provide such an access. Because let's remind us that 90% of all the African utilities are in a terrible financial shape. And it's creating a lot of issues when we are talking about bankable projects and the capacity of the off-taker to actually attract private investors. So there are still major challenges ahead. But what we see from the ground is that there are several ventures and companies that are bringing solutions that could really help to tackle this. And when I was talking about a revolution, I see something very, very interesting coming in the mobility sector, to be honest. And especially for the two-wheelers and the three-wheelers throughout the continent, where so far we've been really relying on petrol. And now the electric mobility is definitely more interesting and cheaper for people to operate it. So you'll see coming in the next 2, 3, 4 years ahead, I think a major change in the energy used for transportation for the vast majority of the African population in Sub-Saharan Africa, because you don't have so much public transportation systems. But I would really insist on the fact that if you look carefully at the market, the on-grid projects are well covered by a lot of actors, and there's no lack of capital, as I think Hector, Antonio said before. The real issue now is how do we make affordable energy for people that are lacking this access? And this will need definitely way more blended finance and public finance and also grant money in order to do this. So it's doable, but now we really need it's a political will in a sense. And in Brazil, for example, at some point they've decided to set the Light for All program, and it brought a major change for 10 million people in Brazil. And they did so because at some point there was a public willingness for this. And this can happen in the coming 2, 3, 4 years, but we'll need a major change here.
Political will indeed, again, another discussion point that will drive deeper across the board over the next hour. But Antonio, I want to come back to you, and I want to pick up on the COVID scenario. And to the extent that you see the climate smart agenda pushed back, renewable energy projects pushed back for the very point that Hector pointed to, is that governments now have limited space to drive aggressive agendas, considering health has overtaken the climate agenda across the world. And further, to the point that to what extent are private sector players able to throw money at the climate problem, given their current constraints and the fact that the world is turned upside down? Antonio.
Yep, of course, these are major challenges. I should say that in Latin America, especially on the energy markets, we reached a certain point where the financing equation is in good shape, I could say this, on most of the region. Of course, there are some countries that are heavily affected by macroeconomic matters like Argentina, or by structural matters like Venezuela, for example. But all around, the equation for the renewables is in good shape. But of course, governments have right now limited space to push the climate agenda. This in fiscal terms. I'm not talking about politics here, of course. And this can be a threat in terms of looking forward in the region somehow. Why? Anytime you need, for example, Brazil. Brazil has a very developed energy market, but BNDES used to play a very important role given some cheap financing all around. If the fiscal space limits the possibility of the local development bank to help financing further on the renewables revolution in Brazil, this can be, from the energy point of view, like a threat or a challenge for transition, energy transition. And one matter that is crucial here is mobility. When you talk about energy transition in Latin America, you're talking about transportation. And this, yes, requires some government agenda to adjust regulatory matters, to give up incentives for substitution on public transportation or in private transportation cars, and of course the issue of the infrastructure. This is a good challenge in Latin America right now. CAF is together with AFD of France and other European agencies going on in action we called emotion, e-mobility, or emotion as we used to call. IDB is putting a lot of stakes on this matter too. And of course, I think there's still space for IFC and World Bank to step in this message. Hector used to be the representative for Brazil. Now he is in Africa, but his friends can always step in and leverage that too. So I think transportation now is the big matter, and the fiscal space will be crucial to build up the environment for going beyond the generation and distribution of energy towards the transportation and electric power and transportation. Thank you.
Rentia, this transportation theme, significant, obviously kick-started by Quentin earlier in the discussion, talking about the revolution that needs to take place in the motorcycle space, three-wheel, two-wheel vehicles across the continent, and obviously into Brazil. I'm talking about the African continent when I mentioned continent there. Just in terms of projects that have been stalled or delayed, what have you seen? And are you worried about the stalling or delaying of projects in the renewable energy space?
Bronwyn, yeah, we've seen certainly delays in many of these projects. I think if you work across Africa, like I said, you need to have patience. Many of these projects start off and you know you've got a very solid sponsor. You can actually drive the project, but in many cases you have delays because of government. And I don't want to put everything to government, but that's why I use the example of, you know, a proper framework. There's legislation in place, the shareholders and the sponsors, the EPC providers and the funders are quite clear in terms of what are the rules of the game. What do I need to do to be able to conclude that PPA? How do I crowd in, you know, both DFIs and commercial funders to get the best in terms of a value proposition for government by having the best tariff? At the end of the day, government want to sign PPAs or contracts that make economic sense for them. I mean, we have examples in Africa where the governments are very uncomfortable with the level of tariffs that they agree to. And we find ourselves in a position, how do we negotiate in a way that, you know, the sponsors and the financiers don't lose money? So I think to come back to your question around delays, these are sometimes warranted. And I think it's better to take your time to put the project together in a manner that you know it's sustainable. The finance will be in place. By the time you reach financial close, you know you've got the right financing partners around the table. But at the same time, you know, we sit with economies that desperately need power. So in South Africa, you know what the delay in rolling out IPPs have done to our economy. I mean, we sit with load shedding, we sit with real challenges in trying to fast track new generation. Government launched a risk mitigation framework. The preferred bidders was announced 2 weeks ago, but yet we don't have the generation capacity feeding into the grid yet. So all of this actually impact the economic development. We had some projects taking us 2 to 3 years to get to financial close. I mean, there's a project in Namibia that everybody refers to. It's now 7 years since the developers started to develop that project and we haven't reached financial close yet. So whether there's valid reasons for those delays, that's to be debated. I think it's twofold. It's a combination of government supporting, working together with private sector towards that ultimate goal of implementation. Thanks.
Patrick, let's get you to come back in here and on Rentia putting forward, you know, the delays, the lengthy nature of getting these projects to fruition. What can we do to accelerate projects? Because time is not on our hands. We understand this well when it comes to the climate and the environment and the situation we find ourselves in as the world. So what would your advice be in terms of acceleration of projects to closure, to fruition, to the provision of renewable energy?
Thank you very much, Bronwyn. I think what is absolutely critical in fast-tracking the projects to financial close lies in the feasibility study and the project prep phase. Because when you get it right there, you will have no issues in achieving financial close. But that requires risk capital, what we call risk capital, to prepare projects. And it tends to invariably comes from the public sector and governments, because that is the biggest catalyzer. I always say to people, a well-prepared project and well-structured project will always attract financing and will always achieve financial growth much more quicker. So the trick lies in that risk capital that needs to be deployed in the early phase of the project so that you deal with all the issues and then you will be able to achieve financial close much more quicker. But not many actually private sector players are keen in getting into that risk capital space because we need to play that role as a development finance institution, including the multilateral development finance institutions. We have to really spearhead that because it's a space that we need to take those risks as public sector institution. We will then be able to catalyze because that normally invariably tends to take about 10% of the total project cost. If you can be able to crowd in public institutions and government minimal funding capacity, we can be able to unlock a lot of projects and achieve financial close much more quicker. I think that also requires skill sets because it's a skill set that is not easily available in the public sector space. But then partnership with the private sector to fast track those projects into financial close is extremely important. So I think that tied in with the regulatory environment or framework is extremely important because when you still have that element of uncertainty and lack of coordination between government departments, we are going to struggle to reach financial close, which actually ends up not boding well for the country's perception in terms of trying to attract foreign direct investments and outside investment into the country when projects tend to take that long.
Hector, this comes back to the theme that you put on the table in that it is about the government creating the enabling environment. This is, of course, a term we've heard repeatedly on many of these debate platforms over and over. But more so today, as you highlighted, with limited fiscal space, it is about, as Patrick is saying, getting the private sector to come in with that risk capital. Is that, in the current environment, a realistic agenda? Are we going to see private sector money coming in to lay the groundwork for the feasibility of these projects?
Yeah. So it's a $30 million question. But look, I think what we will see, and I don't know who mentioned, but I don't want to pin everything on the government. I think there is a better and a sort of smarter use of government resources towards this. I think sort of the very sort of heavy planning approach of the government, it's part of it, but I think there's some long, the way we see it, there are short, mid, and long-term efforts. Okay, so in the long term, I think governments generally across the region in the continent, they need to work towards improving the financial state of utilities, right? Utilities do not recover costs. Utilities, so that's a long-term effort because that's how you make things financeable, right? And that's at the intersection of, it's a very technical solution, but there's also a political sort of context to that. So I think that's sort of a long-term effort. Then in the mid-term, what we see is, I think what Patrick was mentioning, everyone wants the $200 million project or the 200 megawatt project, but no one wants to spend the $5 million that it costs to develop, right? So this is sort of a 5 or 10 or whatever the money is. I think we need to think, I would say out of the box, but we need to approach it differently too. What we've been doing that is sort of illustrates more or less the way we're thinking is actually three things. One is we've been approaching the sort of the grid connected solar generation in two ways. One is sort of bundling or putting together sets of solar plants and then coming out with a standardized financing package so that you do 7 at a time or 13 at a time. This is something that it's been very successful so far in sort of in Northern Africa and the Middle East for us. We have another program that is called Scaling Solar that is in an early stage, that it has a specific niche that it works to addressing the lack of scale or the lack of the high transaction cost of some things. We have high expectations for it, but it's in an early stage. And then we have another approach that we actually we use in Brazil, and it's very successful in Brazil, which is we put together a project structuring facility with BNDES, with the National Development Bank, where we put a capital of around $10-12 million 10 years ago, okay, 11 years ago. In the first 10 years, this facility structure projects. The way it works is it structures projects, takes them to tender, then there is a winning bid, and that winning bid reimburses the costs of developing that project. So it's a revolving facility, right? So in the first 10 years, it mobilized, it attracted around, I think like $7-8 billion in private sector investment. And then most likely in the next 5 years, which is now what is in the pipeline, is gonna mean another 12-15 billion, right? This is not power, this is other sectors in infrastructure, but I think the same could be potentially, maybe in a different scale, to sort of, but I don't think it's there is no silver bullet. You need to attack this through different channels, right? To try to address this issue. Tonder.
Quentin, I want to come back and pick up on the mobility program that you put on the agenda. And for me, just thinking about it, it's something like a chicken and an egg scenario, because you're going to need the electricity to power those vehicles. You're going to need the battery storage capability to largely transform the transportation environment in emerging markets. Can you come back in and just give us a little more on this revolution that you are speaking about?
Yeah, of course. Let's talk precisely about some investment cases. So the issue that you have mainly, especially with mini grids, for example, is that you mainly have clients that are going to consume 2 light bulbs for the coming 4 to 5 years ahead. And it's an issue because you need at some point some good clients that will pay a lot and consume a lot of energy so that you can get your money back, because it's a lot of capex in order to install a sufficient capacity, solar capacity and storage. So you are looking for what we call productive usage. So people that are actually generating money out of the use of electricity, because these guys will be the good clients. And by the way, the development that we see in the C&I space, so companies off-grid willing to have renewable energy, can be a very good news in a developed country. But in an emerging country, it can be problematic because you are stealing the good clients from the utility. So it can be an issue because those guys are good payers, and the utility can somehow be, it can be problematic if they accept those private IPP stealing their good clients. But that's another subject. So if we go back to the mini grids, you're looking for people that are going to pay for your electricity and consume a lot. And the transportation guys, especially in the rural areas, they actually deal with quite a large amount of money because people, they still need to transport and the goods to the right markets and that kind of stuff. So, and when you are in the rural areas, you pay fuel and it's more expensive because you have to bring it from the capital or from the ports. And so those guys are actually paying a lot in fuel, and they are willing to switch to electricity if you offer a lower price. And it's actually possible because when you generate energy from solar, you generate energy during daytime, and most of your consumption is in the morning or at night. So it's actually costing you to store this energy. Whereas if you have guys that are willing to pay for your energy during daytime, it's actually very interesting for those mini grid operators. But if you look at transportation in urban areas, then it's a different scheme. As you were saying, and you were right, it can be problematic, especially in countries where you have electric shortages in those capitals. And that's why the actors that we see are laying out an infrastructure of battery swap systems equipped with solar panels, meaning that they can rely on the grid or they can generate their own electricity so that they're able to charge the battery, so that the motorcycle riders can actually go and swap their batteries at the points that they've laid out throughout the cities. So here there is an economic case. It's actually working as we speak, especially in Eastern African countries. We're right at the beginning, but it will come very fast. And actually, African governments will push for this because it will reduce their fuel consumption, which is affecting their fiscal capacities. And it will also help to reduce the pollution in some crowded African capitals where it's becoming a real issue, a public health issue, of course.
So, Antonio, let's pick up on this discussion point that mini grids are potentially the best way to fast track a climate smart future in the developing world. To what extent are you seeing that agenda being aggressively driven from a perspective in Brazil?
Well, I can talk more broadly on the region. I work with Brazil, but actually our work with Brazil, especially on energy environment, is very restricted to Eletrobras right now.
So Latin, as you say, to the region, rather than you rephrase that. Let's talk about Latin America as a whole, your space.
Okay. Well, today the climate agenda is pretty in shape all around the region because the region is heavily affected by climate change. For example, droughts in Chile, on Central America and Panama, where I live, a lot of change on the rainy cycles, issues around Peru. So the region is already being affected, and it's one time reacting and trying to be aggressive. Some countries are trying to be really aggressive on this, especially the island countries that are, the most affected, like Trinidad and Tobago. They're suffering a lot, and they're pushing hard the agenda. But other countries like Colombia, like Chile, Uruguay, etc., have this very much in mind. In Brazil, there are at state levels a lot of work on that. On federal level, the issue of the Amazon that's been discussed a lot on the last 2 to 3 years has been issue for great attention right now. And one of the big challenges on this is the balancing of economics, especially agricultural and mining, that the region is specializing on it, unfortunately, and dealing with climate issues, especially with forests. This has been a headache for some time, but right now, I think countries are finding their balance, looking at sustainability from the bundle of economic activities that are strictly under they're leading right now, and the issue, especially on deforestation. The question of energy here is, complements all the concerns. But what I've been seeing from regulatory and legal terms is moving forward on all this agenda. And somehow populations are adapting themselves to this new framework and the new mindset, what I say. So from Latin America region, I think we're looking forward to have really the design of a sustainable economy on the long run. The great challenge, I think, connected to this is inequality. Without dealing with inequality, it will be rather difficult to balance the climate agenda that's going on right now. Thanks.
Rentia, you spoke earlier about Standard Bank's presence in just over 20 countries across the African continent. Perhaps you can give us a little insight into how aggressively the agenda is being driven for independent power producers in those countries that you are operating in beyond South Africa.
Thanks, Bronwyn. Yeah, it's a good question. I think, like I said previously, everybody want to finance these projects, especially if it's bankable because it's green, it's got the right agenda, it's ESG goals. If you look at where we as a group are, I mean, even at our AGM, right at the top of the list is the ESG agenda. So when we look at Africa, I have to be honest with you, we've grown our renewable book over the past 5 to 7 years to the point that, you know, it's still biased towards South Africa. And that is really just as a function of the program. And as Patrick said, you know, it's a framework, there's deadlines, and the government is quite committed. However, if you look beyond South Africa, it has been more difficult. We have projects in Kenya. We've done some projects. We're in the process of closing a solar project there. We participated in a well-known project called Lake Takana, a 300 megawatt wind project that's well known to most of you. I think the other market that we've seen taken off is definitely Namibia, as I mentioned earlier, not only because of their program.
You also mentioned delays in the Namibia project.
Yes, exactly. I mean, we haven't closed the one that's been 7 years under development. We still have a mandate to finance that and hope we can get it across the line. But apart from that, the government successfully there launched 70 megawatts, 14 projects, rolling out 5 megawatts, and with a feed-in tariff. And I think the good thing there was it did put Namibia on the spotlight and its commitment to renewables. Post that, we saw a lot of private companies actually more interested. We closed a project that's now operational for about a year called Hardap. It's a 40 megawatt solar project with a client. There's another project, a 20 megawatt, that we're in the process of finalizing financial close. So I think definitely a market to watch. Apart from that, we've seen some developments, and the IFC financed a solar project in Mozambique. And I think exactly to my earlier point, the reason why we need the DFIs to work with us, that was a very good example where we had a client with a great track record. We've been financing them in South Africa, and we couldn't do it on our own in Mozambique just because of the current risk around the off-taker, the bankability. And we worked closely with IFC, and IFC were the main lender on that project, and we provided most of the banking facilities, guarantees, etc. So it's one of the first sizable solar projects in Mozambique. So just to name a few, I think there's Botswana is underway. I know there's a tender out 2 times 50 megawatts. We've supported a number of clients, and again, waiting for government to make a decision on who are those preferred bidders. So I believe it's exciting, but I do think COVID has put some strain on these balance sheets of governments, and certainly a bit of a delay in rolling out more aggressively.
You know, Hector, I think the theme coming through, so many projects being spoken about, there is movement. There is a lot underfoot across both Latin America and the African continent. Is it not now just about exporting best practice in those examples that are working and creating, you know, those private-public partnerships that we started off the discussion on? Is that it could be full steam ahead. It sounds as though there are so many working formulas in different territories across the landscape that we're discussing today.
Yeah, I mean, so I know it sounds, I hear you. It sounds like, I think, as it was mentioned, you need to be patiently impatient, right? But it's with the impatient generally winning. I think the issues that you have, and the reason why is that, while on paper these things are, you know, the replicability should be very high. The fact that you are dealing with in the space of regulation and the political economy of governments and so on, then makes it that is, you know, maybe the principles stay the same. So, but the specific context in each country makes it hard to replicate. Okay, I think that's sort of our experience. We see our role as mostly helping do the 1, 2, 3 transactions, and then hopefully, you know, helping address the risk, and hopefully the market takes over, and then the commercial banks come in. I think the case of in Mozambique, it sort of leads towards that direction. But then you have, that's one piece. I think the other piece is you have a problem that is generally across, maybe except for Namibia, I would say, at least the countries that I cover, which is this very dire state of the public utilities, right, which are the off-takers. And this leads you to essentially spend a lot of time structuring around that risk of the off-taker. So if you look at how much time is spent in putting together these projects, most of it is spent around how do I mitigate the risk that this utility really doesn't have the cash flow to pay, right? So I think that's why for us it's very important that in the long term there is an effort to improve this. I think the other piece that I would just mention is that I do see some green shoots in terms of governments starting to consider in their long-term planning off-grid solutions, right? So mini grids, right? And this is something that, I think we as multilaterals and DFIs should be able to help them identify the 1, 2, 3 to create a track record and then replicate. Because I think then within country, it's easy to replicate. The problem is to replicate from one market to another. This is sort of our experience. I'll stop there.
Patrick, I want to come back to a theme that you touched on right in the beginning of this discussion, and that was the importance of regional power pools, and especially with the additional impetus from the African Continental Free Trade Area, again, talking about the African continent. To what extent are you, as the Development Bank of South Africa, also driving the independent power producers as off-grid mini solutions into the rest of Africa? Surely it's got to be a balanced approach. You'll have your regional power pools, but they won't be the only solution to providing electricity and power, and specifically renewable energy, to the continent at large.
Thank you, Bronwyn. I think the need for functional and effective regional power pools will be very critical for the continent, especially in the light of the continental free trade area that you're referring to as a big enabler of economic growth on the continent. And here, talking about energy, it's the biggest catalyst of all infrastructure types for economic growth. I think what we need to do, these off-grids, actually, they come quite handy, these off-grid solutions and microgrids. They come in quite handy, especially for rural communities, and also where it could easily, even in suburban area, you could roll that out much more quicker, and renewable energy is much more quicker to put into production than the traditional ones. But we are seeing an increasing choice for the PPPs approach, the public-private partnerships across the continent, hence our engagement with various governments to share the experience of South Africa in terms of the independent power producers, because that also takes off the pressure from the central fiscus. And the pandemic made it even much more worse, because now we have the social challenges that are now actually competing with the need to drive effective infrastructure. But now, if we can be able to get into this mode of IPPs or independent power producers, it really can fast track the deployment and the availability of power to various communities across the continent much more quicker. It really, and also what it does, the possibilities of green bonds. There is massive capital globally that is itching for renewable energy projects, especially along the lines of IPPs. So we just need to make it possible, as Hector was referring to earlier on, that let government be big enablers. We will be able to see a remarkable development. There is increasingly more money that actually now is available for qualifying renewable energy projects across the continent. We must just take advantage of that and let the government focus largely on the other social issues and the infrastructure, especially the economic infrastructure, really can be a very big catalyst to restart and to drive the recovery of our economy post the COVID pandemic.
Quentin, before I go into a final round on all the panelists, I'm going to just ask you to give me a bit more on the blended finance solutions that you referred to earlier in the discussion, in terms of what is working. And again, it's not one size fits all, but perhaps you can just weigh in with what your experience has shown, specifically in the transportation, the mobility, the renewable energy space. I'm going to ask you to touch on that. And while you are doing that, I'm going to ask our fellow panelists to get ready for their closing comments. We have 15 minutes left in the discussion, and I certainly don't want you, as the experts in this space, to walk away from this debate saying, I was not asked the right questions. I had more to say. There was more that I wanted to bring to the forefront. So that is the agenda for everyone. I will go round table again. Please leave our audience today with what you want to weigh in on in terms of how it pertains to the debate at hand. And that, of course, I will remind you, is on the infrastructure, finance, and renewable energy. We had started saying fostering PPPs for shared prosperity. It's within the broader seminar, Renewable Energy in Brazil and Africa. So that's your task. Quentin, you're going to have a double shot at this. First of all, talk to me about the blended finance solutions.
Wow, thanks a lot. Here, I think it's important to remind that cheap energy is the basis of development. And if you are able to provide a cheap energy, you will ease a lot the work of the government. And the issue here is that still for now, when you are in a government seat, and you have to choose between coal and hydro or solar. Or, coal is definitely an interesting and cheap option. And the issue is, how do you reduce the cost of capital for renewable projects? And for this, as I was saying, the blended finance instruments can be very useful because you can attract private capital and reduce the risk premium. The problem is that when we are talking about Africa, there's a risk premium that is way too high compared to the reality. But this kind of a psychological issue with the African continent, where private investor will definitely have a risk premium that is much higher compared to other emerging countries. And this is a major issue where DFIs, public entities need to be very invested on. They need to provide those guarantees to de-risk the capital, to make sure that the projects that we've mentioned earlier on, such as e-mobility, access to energy, are really able to attract pools of capital that are available on the market. You know, when you look at European markets, because I actually come from France, I mean, you can now, if you are EDF, the French utility, you can have a green bond and have private debt at 0%. If you are a private actor trying to provide access to energy in Madagascar, you will maybe find, in the best scenario, you will be able to attract debt at 10%, 12% interest. When we are talking about providing energy for all, these interest rates are not compatible with what we've been talking earlier on, meaning scaling operations and reaching those 600 million people. So you hear a lot in the news, big announcements with a lot of money being dedicated to access to energy in Africa and everything. And I mean, I'm on the ground, I'm helping those actors, and I can tell you the money is not there, to be honest. So we definitely need to accelerate these blended finance schemes. For example, I think that the results-based finance is a very effective way to actually unlock access to energy. It has been tested by some DFIs, meaning that you will unlock part of the grant money as the private actor, is able to show you that he has connected people. This is very effective, and there you can mix it with concessional debt, for example. That would be very interesting. And thanks, Hector, for mentioning the programs that IFC set up for the solar IPPs, because I think it has been very effective scaling solar so far. And I know that IFC is working on a scaling mini grid program also in order to unlock also the access to capital to those programs. And I think this is the main issue. We need to reduce the cost of capital for those actors. We need to make grants available faster. And why I'm saying that is that the more we wait, the more the temptation for those governments with the political pressure that they will have, they'll be tempted to go to coal and other issues, not because they want to have, they want to pollute, but just because they need to provide energy to the population.
Antonio, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Brian. Let me build a little bit on a thing that was mentioned, I think, by Quentin, Patrick, and Hector. The situation of utility companies, microgrids, independent generation, small scale, and the future of PPPs in energy. Up to now, I think the backbone of PPPs in the private participation in the energy sector is on the PPAs. Still, we have some experiments of private financing of spot buyers in the energy market, but this is still small scale. And I think it was 2018, Ernst & Young issued a study about impacts of independent generation and microgrids on utilities in Europe. And the potential impact is huge. So starting to plan dealing with this problem of the future of the utility company, especially in energy, I think is our immediate task. We have to look into this problem, how to change the business models of the utilities in order to provide support for a continuous flow of PPPs in the energy sector, because private financing and private participation will still be, at least in Latin America, the leading form of expanding both generation, transmission, and distribution. I think this is a very interesting and challenging question. And of course, digitalization and all the innovations coming in pose a huge challenge for the sector. And I'd like to leave this message on the end just to buzz it a little bit more our dear audience. Thank you.
Rentia?
Thanks, Bronwyn. I think maybe just to conclude, there's three things that I think is very evident from this discussion. The one is we sit with weak sovereigns, especially in Africa, weak utilities, lack of bankable projects, and then a currency mismatch. So as long as you have a currency mismatch in terms of IPPs signing PPAs in hard currency, but collecting in local currency, you will effectively continue to set them up to fail. So I know it's difficult to fund projects in local currency. I think one of the things that we are looking at, especially in the countries where we have presence and balance sheet, is to facilitate enhanced local currency facilities. And in that case, it's important for us to work with DFIs. And I think we should not underestimate the partnerships of DFIs and commercial banks in bringing together these solutions to make it easier for both private sector and public sector. Thanks.
Patrick, floor is yours.
Thank you, Bronwyn. I think it's going to be quite important, especially for the emerging countries, to really embrace the renewable energy. Yes, we know that the storage is still somewhat expensive, but it is actually coming down quite drastically. And we're quite positive that within the next 5 to 10 years, the battery storage will actually have really come down a lot, which then will enable a lot of renewable energy generation without actually the hindrance of expensive storage. But I think what is key also here is the pandemic has really laid bare the fault lines, the socioeconomic fault lines in terms of lack of inclusive societies. These renewable energy, in South Africa, we really also made sure that the communities where these renewable energy plants actually were built, they also had community trust and participation in this. We need to look at it, and also the issue of local content. But local content will really require an ongoing investment and availability of opportunities. But I think these are the kinds of things that we need to look at. I like the Brazilian experience of biofuels. We actually are also working very closely and collaborating quite closely with the Brazilian embassy in South Africa, in Piracicaba as well in Brazil, on their biofuel. They are the global leaders where they were able to make rural communities to generate biofuel for the suburban transport system and to really create massive economic opportunities on a sustainable basis. So I think for us and for us as the Development Bank of Southern Africa, we really are partnering with also the International Development Finance Clubs led by the French AFD and KfW of Germany across the globe. CAF is also a member. We really are working quite closely to see how we can drive the sustainable development and also a greening of the environment and taking countries into just transition so that we are able to achieve our sustainable development goals. And the Green Climate Fund is also very much our partner here. We are one of the accredited institutions as DBSA on the continent. There are massive opportunities that we really can be able to tap on and make sure that we are able to bring in the risk capital, which will unlock the infrastructure development on the African continent. And I think the same can be said for other emerging economies as well. Thank you, Bronwyn.
Hector.
Thanks, Bronwyn. Look, I think the energy agenda clearly is core. It's an enabler. I see another piece, which is it will allow us to then replicate it to other sectors in this country. So it's whether it's water and sanitation. So it's how to develop the private sector engagement. I think I fully agree with what said. I think these are very complex issues, so we need to work together. There is not one institution that can solve them on its own. We need to do partnerships to address and to sort of share risk. In my view, if I was going to come with an agenda, I think the agenda that we still need to, probably 10 years from now, we'll still be working on it. It's around addressing a few things, which is, the scale of projects, sort of I think the increased competition. You still have a lot of particularly in the solar space, a lot of the projects are from, bilateral negotiations, not necessarily competitive processes. So, competition should generally be better. We need to reduce the transaction cost of this type of deals. We need to reduce, I think this was Quentin mentioned, the risk perception. Okay, this is something that there is the real risk and the perceived risk. We need to work together around this. And I think one piece is we need to improve the institutional capacity on the governments that are working. And it is something that I think we as multilaterals can engage into that to help them sort of develop and host better projects. The final piece for me is that all of these, let's say the holy grail will be when we can do the same also for the off-grid and for the mini-grid. So this is a very clear agenda on the grid connected. I think on the mini-grid is emerging. It's exciting, but also at the same time is really, really challenging. I'll stop there.
And Quentin, final word to you before we close the panel.
Yeah, thanks. Well, first, thanks so much, because I think it was very interesting to have all those different views and those backgrounds. And as Hector just said, I think we really need to work hand in hand. I just wanted to maybe conclude with the fact that we've been talking a lot about the production part of it. But I think two other main pillars are very important if we want to tackle this access to energy issue in sub-Saharan Africa. One is, of course, the commercial and technical losses, because when you look at African grids, in some part of sub-Saharan Africa, we lose up to 30% of what we produce, 30. which means that if you were able to tackle at least 20%, let's say, it's something that you don't need to add in terms of production. So meaning that there's a lot of efforts to be made here, investments in the grid, as Patrick mentioned, with the regional hubs, but I think also inside countries, there are a lot of investments that need to be made in those grids to make them at least robust, but also smart at some point. So that's the second pillar. And the third pillar that is very interesting, and I think there's a lot also of very interesting ventures there, is all the energy efficiency part of this. I mean that the access to energy, especially the solar home systems, were possible because of LED lighting. Otherwise, when you had regular light bulbs, it was impossible to feed them with a small solar panel. But now we're really trying to tackle the issue of cold storage, for example, because most of the African farmers, they lose up to 30%, 35% of what they produce because they can't store properly the production. And here we see very interesting ventures and solutions coming up. And you'll have the same also with irrigation. So I think it's enabling, as Hector started to mention, other possibilities in other sectors, but definitely challenging times ahead. And if we want to cope with the Paris Agreement, I think we need to accelerate a lot.
Thank you very much. Been chatting to Mr. Antonio Pinheiro Silveira. He's the Vice President for Infrastructure of the Development Bank of Latin America. Mr. Rentia from Tonder, Head of Renewable Energy, Power and Infrastructure at Standard Bank. Mr. Patrick Dlamini, President of the Development Bank of Southern Africa. Mr. Hector Gomez-Ang, who is the Country Manager for Angola, Mozambique, Zambia and Botswana at the International Finance Corporation. And Mr. Quentin Sauzay, who is the Director at SouthBridge Group. Jean, I'm going to hand back to you at this point. Thank you so much for the robust discussion to all our panelists.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you very much, Bronwyn, for your great moderation. Also, thank you for all the guests that you had with you. It was a very nice conversation. And I know the audience is bringing to us an important message. I understand we have so many things that we could emphasize, but I want to raise, Bronwyn, something directed to you. And by the way, congratulations for your great job in front of Nielsen Network. I've been following you in many interviews that you are doing with many people in this moment of distance, right? I want to raise something to you. With your experience, interview many people for many different areas, not only health, but economy, infrastructure, and now we talk about energy. What is your take when you hear from the guests that you previously interviewed? What do you think that we should do? What do you think that Brazil and Africa can put together from your experience? Please.
So I am always one of physically sharing a best practice. And I think, Ja, we have had this discussion before, but I think that once we move beyond the COVID-19 pandemic, I think that the ideas are interchangeable in many instances. Of course, our panelists today have cautioned that one size does not fit all with regards to the many, many different countries we operate across when it comes to Brazil, when it comes to Africa. But we need to be on the ground physically and demonstrate the projects, whether they are in the renewable space, the infrastructure space, demonstrate them. So I would like to see more of that happening. Once the world comes back to some semblance of normality and we can all travel to our respective destinations.
Yeah, you mentioned when the world is able to receive us traveling, and I don't know for how long you are isolated in South Africa. Since last year, I'm not traveling too much, and I understand Hector, Quentin, and Patrick, you're not traveling as well. Bronwyn, from your perspective as well, South Africa is one leader in the continent, in Africa, right? And Brazil is very close to South Africa. What lessons you think Brazil can learn from the African perspective, not only South Africa, in terms of accessibility of energy?
It's a difficult question because at the moment, as we speak, we sit in South Africa, and I will come to the rest of Africa in just a moment, but we are in a very precarious situation from an electricity provision point of view here in South Africa, given the fact that our incumbent utility is battling with consistent provision. We have seen, and this is where I think the lesson does lie, and Patrick will back me up on this, and so will Rentia, is that the Independent Power Producer Project in South Africa has been one of the most successful in the world with regards to renewable energy. So I think that is the solution. I think it does lie in terms of microgrids. It allows, it's important when it comes to deregulation and allowing the private sector to help provide the solutions. As so far as the rest of the continent, I think that you're seeing the emergence of microgrids popping up all over the continent in an attempt to solve the power outages. But I want to come back to that stark reality, Jean, that more than 600 million people across the African continent have absolutely no access to any form of power. And in as much as that is a huge challenge, I do believe that that old adage of the fact that there is no legacy infrastructure, that we can leapfrog. We use that term all the time on these debates, but we can leapfrog with the latest technologies, with digital innovations, with renewable energy solutions, borrowing from solar and wind to rectify a situation that has existed for an inordinate amount of time and needs to be fast-tracked so that everybody can have access to clean energy at the end of the day.
Okay, thank you very much, Bronwyn, for your great answer. I know it's not easy to answer very specifically that question, but I understand the situation now. It's important for us to learn, to understand the needs that we have, not only South Africa, not only Brazil, but the moment that we're facing bring us the perspective that we have to work together. I would like to stay longer with you, but I know you and us, we have other agendas. I know Hector, Quentin, and Patrick, and Bronwyn, you want to come to Brazil. That's my commitment. As soon as the gates are open, you will need to come to Brazil to stay with us. And the agenda will be very important for us to emphasize what we should do. Once again, Hector, Quentin, and Patrick, and Bronwyn, thank you very much for your great participation. Hopefully, soon I will be able to see you in person. Thank you.